Welcome to the lecture on standing, the first of the 5 figures, the 5 postures that make up the grace machine. I'm using the word posture here in relationship to Edmund Burke, who made this marvelous, very short piece in the Philosophical Inquiry, very tiny piece on grace. Of course, there are many more pieces on the sublime, on the beautiful, on the magnificent, everything. But on grace is almost the smallest, and but it has some beautiful remarks that we discussed in the introduction. One of those is posture and motion. Grace is a question or a matter of posture and motion, and that says a lot, because of course somebody can be graceful when they're moving, or somebody in a posture can be graceful, but it's actually a very deep construction, because it connects posture, which is posited, right? So it's like in repose, and motion. So how can you have an aesthetic quality that is both part of a world of motion and a world of repose? And that's the big secret here. So somehow the notion, because he's not saying object and motion, object and movement, of course object would be beauty, and he's not discussing beauty in this case, he's discussing grace. So it's about posture. So somehow posture is capable of combining this notion of an object and motion. So it's a very powerful idea. Now, we've selected those 5 main postures, but standing itself is the primary figure, is the primary posture. And that's for many reasons. I think the deepest question is, I mean, this is the lecture that is the most philosophical of the many we're going to do, is that it's both an ontological statement and one that drives it in a direction of an aesthetics. And of course many have said that since the last 15-20 years that we're searching for a philosophy where aesthetics drives the ontology, or maybe better put, where aesthetics is first philosophy, as a paradigm or a paraphrasing of Aristotle. I think Graham Harman was the first one, maybe in 2007, who said that. So aesthetics, but then you cannot just refer to aesthetics, you actually have to use aesthetic arguments. And we find those in grace, and it's a very important notion that grace, of course obviously coming from religion as well as from aesthetics, that somehow these 2 powers are merged. So that's what we're going to do, and with the idea of standing, this will be the most intense of the lectures. Now, I've divided those in a number of parts, in 3 parts, and for myself I divide up these 3 parts in subparts. Now you won't notice those, I hope, because I'm making little jumps and sometimes huge jumps, but you will see that there's like 3 blocks, one of realism, one of the figure, and one of the void. So these 3 together make up this whole construct around standing. Now, logically, already mentioning ontology and aesthetics as first philosophy, that makes realism the most important topic. And then we're going to move towards the figure, how that actually relates to this idea of realism, and the void, the 3rd part of this lecture, will actually start to refer to something we're going to discuss when we're going toward the figure of jumping. So realism, let's just put that very big on the screen. Obviously one of the most important topics of the last 20, 30 years, is deeply related to the idea of standing. Of course, realism in philosophy means it's a philosophy of entities, and entities are independent. And literally, the word independent means not to hang from. Not to hang from means to stand by itself. So there we go already. That the idea of the real means we're talking about entities that stand. Now, there's many ways of standing, and we're going toward that. We're going to construct a very specific form of standing, not just like the wide-legged, stable form of standing, but obviously one that's infected by grace. The other relationship is that the idea of the real, or to exist. Let's not forget that in Latin the word existence actually means to stand forth. So to stand forth is actually an exercise of the real. It's not just existence, but also persistence and insistence. There's a lot of words that relate to that. Now let's go to the entities, and I do want to refer back to many titles that have the word thing in them. Now let's make that clear right away. The word thing in Latin is res, and real or reality is what belongs to res, to things. Right, so the notion of entity and the notion of a thing are strongly related. So whatever realism is, it must be a philosophy of things. And of course, we've seen many titles with the word thing. Chinua Achebe already in the 1950s. Things Fall Apart. Heidegger, obviously, the thing, it was the late 1950s, and then the last 20 years, the thing. Bill Brown edited a book. Daniel Miller, the comfort of things. William Connolly, the fragility of things. My own, of course, the sympathy of things, which I wrote more than 10 years ago. And Steve Severo's the universe of things. So there's many thing titles, and of course there's poetry of things. I'm just thinking of Ryuk and his Dinggedichte. Francis Ponge, the poet of things. So there's a lot of thinking, and especially in since the late 1980s in sociology. Of course, that's why I'm putting Appadurai up there. Sociology, we find it in archaeology, we find it in anthropology. This notion of realism obviously strongly related to materialism, new materialism, but they're not the same. They're absolutely not the same, and of course there's been a slow split between, let's say, a materialist strand and a realist strand. But it is important to note how powerful this idea of a thing is. If you just look it up in the dictionary, it says case, it says matter, it says affair, it says behavior, it says business. It's a fantastic term. How are things going? Where are my things? There's like an enormous range. When we speak about a thing, or things, or how things go, we can mean objects, hard objects, small objects, fragile objects, as well as events or whole like stretches or periods or episodes or matters. Or it's such a wide concept and such a beautiful concept that we have to like realize how important this is. There's a good reason why I'm putting both Bruno Latour and Appadurai up there. I think Appadurai, The Social Life of Things. This is, I think, 1986. He edited this book with a beautiful text in it by Alfred Gell, by the way. And that notion of the social goes in two directions. One is that the social, or that the thing is networked in a social context. The notion of an assembly, the notion, of course, Heidegger with his notion of gathering, the Sammlung. So that means somehow that the thing must be networked. But then itself, the thing is itself networked. A society, Whitehead called it. So things are societies of parts, and these parts are active, and they make up this thing. So this notion of a social or some kind of subjectivity or relationality is deeply embedded in it. And obviously we can go in both directions. One is sort of inward and one is outward, to find this idea of a subjective. So there would be a notion of the assembly in one direction, and of course the assemblage in the other direction. Assemblage, of course, the English translation of Deleuze's agencement. So agency comes in here as well, and that links beautifully back to Alfred Gell as well. Now, making things public, a beautiful book edited by Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel from the ZKM in Karlsruhe, who've done so many exhibitions together, with this incredible text by Bruno Latour that introduces the catalogue. And obviously it is deeply related to the idea of gathering. Of course, obviously, Bruno Latour, the actor network theory, so that the thing as an actant, as an actant. I'm not sure if you can actually translate it like that, but it's an actant. So there is agency, and things act on us. They impose themselves upon us, and so that there's a need for this gathering, which is quite clear that it relates to the public. So there's a deep relationship between things and how to be public. We know that from Heidegger as well, things in the clearing, but also things being Offenbarung and Offenbar. There's a very complex German word. Offen is clearly open, but bar is even more. It relates to bearing, to a certain sense of weight and carrying. But there's this notion of opening up when we even speak of the word thing, we imply this openness. So the way things react to us and affect us is sort of embedded in the notion of the public. So this gathering is very public, and that's very important for Latour. That's why we see that word parliament in the parliaments of nature at the bottom of the cover. Parliament, of course, in the Icelandic language, this is very well known to everybody. It's the althing, So in the Nordic languages, you will see the word thing in a much more political context, and of course we know that from Latin republic. You know, the res publica, the public affairs, the state of public affairs. So there's a political notion, a social notion. There's a constructedness of the public, or of, I wouldn't say publicity, but how things can be opened up. What's really interesting about Latour's text, an introduction to the catalogue, is that he distinguishes between matters of fact and matters of concern. This is very well known, of course, and it's again very Heideggerian, because matters of fact relate to this beautiful German word Gegenstand, which is such an interesting word because it means stand against. There we go, with the word standing again. It stands against, and of course, it translated in English, it becomes object to be thrown against, right? So we have two notions here, which are already interesting. Is that though it's a matter of fact, that fact or that facticity is then it stands. And it stands against, but while it stands against, it also throws itself at us. So there is a notion of throwing. I think that needs to be very clear. And obviously, with Heidegger, there is the contrast between Gegenstand and Ding. So the Gegenstand is on the side of what Latour calls the matters of fact, and the Ding on the side of the matters of concern. And concern translates in German to Sorge, which is another very Heideggerian term. So let's just sort of understand what this is. And Latour says, has a very clear sentence about this. So objects are hard, they have a clear contour, and they stand in a realm that's, he calls it translucent. So there's some kind of connection to consciousness and light in there. Well, actually, the matters of concern are much more blurry, he calls them blurry and vague, and do not have very clear contours. And I think that's very important. So this notion of throwing and not having clear contours, we must try to find those and a way to put those together. Now, another text of Latour that we see on the left, can we get our materialism back, please? It's quite hilarious. Bruno Latour is very funny, very often very funny, and he uses this beautiful term for materialism, or for this matters of fact materialism, table thumping materialism, like this. And everybody who ever were in a conference, you know, with engineers or any other technically oriented people will often have encountered this sort of ideas. Like when we talk theory, suddenly there's one figure in the panel that knocks on the table and says, "Yeah, but this is real. This table is real," and then sort of emphasizing or confirming that by knocking on the table. Now, I'm not sure about your table, but the table I'm knocking on is actually made of wood. And for sure, I'm knocking on the wood, but I'm not so sure I'm knocking on the table. And of course, in Latour's, if we consider that table as a matter of concern, that means it has many threads in many directions, and it's not just my consciousness that makes this thing a table, but I can imagine an ant walking over it and not knowing it's a table, obviously, or I can imagine a beaver nibbling at one of the legs and not knowing it's a table. I can imagine the sun shining on it, or a fire destroying it, and that already means that we have many blurred forms of this knock thing, and it loses its contours there, or these contours differ and change constantly. So in that sense, that thing is soft and blurry. And you can even go further here. I mean, I'm not a Platonist, but if you would knock, well, Plato is sitting across the table, and you would say, look, this is real, and then confirm it by knocking hard. Plato would laugh straight in your face, and he'd say, well, obviously you're knocking on the wood, but you cannot knock on a table because a table is a concept. It's an idea, and that idea actually resides in the mind or somewhere high up, and that's where it's real, and it's not real where you're knocking it. So even from a Platonic point of view, there's no table thumping. I remember another text by Latour where he's actually not using the word table thumping materialism, but table thumping realism. I think that's it's about the style of the matters of concern. Of course, that occupies our minds extremely, because the style of the matters of concern is really an aesthetic question, and it needs to be answered in an aesthetic sense. Now I put Latour's materialism text next to the cover of Rick Dolfijn and Iris van der Tuin on new materialism, with those many beautiful interviews with Mauro de Landa and Karen Barrett and all these figures, and of what we nowadays call new materialism. And well, it's clear how new materialism differs from old materialism. Old materialism is linear causality. It means that there's a linear cause for this thing to exist, a linear cause in the scientific sense, but also in the sense of maybe even Aristotle, the four causes make up any table. If we're still talking about the table, but we're not knocking on it. And that's the material cause, obviously. So there's the wood, and there's the ergon, the efficient cause, and then there's the formal cause. But these three are really existent on the level of the parts. So they organize the parts in their place, and these parts come together in the form of a table, and then this table acts. It's either on ants or on beavers or on me or on the books that are stacked on it, or the glass of water that rests on it. That makes it a table for Aristotle. So we have the four causes do not exist on the same level. There's the three, and those three organize the parts, and they make that whole, which is a table. But it doesn't know it yet. It's a table, because that table acts between other wholes, and that's the word of telos. That's the word of substance and ousia, because it's the final cause. So the final cause actually gives this object or this thing a goal, networking it between all those other things. Now that's obviously a question of consciousness. So it's the parts that are brought together, right? But we don't know how they're being brought together, because we only know how they're brought together after that thing is a whole, and how it acts between other wholes. So there must be some kind of loop here, right? So the whole acting on other wholes, there's a consciousness of that loops back and steers these other three causes into their position, right? As a mind, obviously, as a mind, and then converging these three, into one object that can have many different shapes, obviously. Now, this is a version of what Aristotle calls entelechy, and this is interesting because it means that the telos is not necessarily on the outside of things, because entelechy actually means there's an internal telos, there's an internal goal that steers these three and coordinates them in such a way that a table comes out. It's not the same, but it is related to what our modern notion of immanence, and certainly to our modern notion of emergence. Emergence, and this is where my problem starts with new materialism, is that emergence, which is, by the way, a new form of the Greek physis, right? So physis is generally translated by nature, which is wrong. It should be translated by the word genesis, or the processes of nature that make things, that make products. So physis is always a force. It's not just a realm. It's really a force, and it's a force that drives things. Of course, with Romanticism, this notion of driving from the potential to the actual becomes the German Trieb, right? So the Trieb ends up 100 years later in the hands of Sigmund Freud. Now, let me just discuss my problems with this idea of emergence, because when things emerge, they follow a vertical path. Emerge means rising up. So, and we see lots of those sentences, right, where the parts rise up to the whole, right, or matter rises up to the spirit, or there is a convergence, there's a contraction, it's very active, and somehow then it plops into another state, and that it becomes whatever. But it is, we cannot deny that the word emergence is a vertically oriented term. Now, I don't want to do this too often, but this is a lecture about standing. So there is a vertical axis. Now there is an issue when we discuss a realism in the context of flat ontology, the term that Manuel de Landa borrows from Roy Bhaskar. There's a contradiction here. How can there be flat ontology? How can there be a reality of parts and a reality of wholes? Because parts in that sense are just little holes, and holes are small parts. How can there then be this verticalism? I'm not against it. I'm not against the verticalism, but I think purely to understand it out of a plane of immanence, so to speak, to borrow Deleuze's term, right? Obviously, the idea of flat ontology must be linked, or is linked, to the flatness, that flat realm, that flat field. It's field theory, basically, of immanence. How can anything emerge out of that flat plane and take a vertical route and actually become a thing beyond that plane, or intersected by that plane? But there is a vertical dimension. Now, I know for sure, that when we have the plane of immanence, I didn't really prepare this, but it is a flat plane. And I do know that, for Deleuze, a thing is actually a crease, it's a fold. So, for sure, so a thing, or a singularity, or a hexaity in his terms, does not properly leave the plane of immanence. And in that sense, we remain flat, in a flat relationship with others. But obviously, if we look at the side of this plane of immanence, we see a vertical dimension to it. And I'm just asking myself, where does this verticality come from? Shouldn't we just allow for transcendence, and find a way to incorporate a transcendence? Maybe not the heavenly Platonic forms of transcendence, but at least maybe what Latour calls a mini transcendence, a very local transcendence, and very bound, not like a second space or a new realm, but something that allows for things to emerge. Now, I just want to leave those questions. This is a very different image. What you see on the left, I want to discuss that first, is an image from Indonesia of a tribe called the Dayak. Now, that in itself, that's not so important. What is important is that this is one of the most beautiful models of philosophical models of William James in Radical Empiricism, where he discusses the nature of entities, and he actually calls them experiences. So an entity can be pure experience. He calls it pure experience. Now I'm not going into the philosophy of William James, and there's many questions obviously, but it is a beautiful example because he suddenly, and it's very sudden, uses this example of the Dijk's head, and so his notion of a thing is double. It's almost like we have a double contour for things. One is that hard object, the skull, right? That we might relate it to death, and that might be another question. And then all those feathers and all those strings hanging from it, as a sort of pre-relational or maybe relational strands that project, are thrown out of that thing. Into an environment and make a new second contour that obviously is vague and blurred, right? So we have what a thing is. It is two things. It is a contracted state, which is opaque, maybe related to death, but clear. And there's a blurred state, and which is well, is it relational or not? Of course, many have accused William James of a purely relational philosophy, but he was a pluralist for sure, and that means that things exist as entities, and for him those entities were like throwing themselves in all directions with withness and nextness and beyondness and onness and whatever these beautiful terms of William James. That things just like reach out or stretch themselves out, but again in a double state. So and he does use the word halo, not very often, but and that's why I put Apollo there with his fabulous hairdo. But it's not the hair I'm interested in now. Though there is a skull and there are frayed lines coming from that head, or fringes, as William James would call them. There's this halo. So somehow this object sort of transits in transitions into light. It is a beautiful idea, and of course, as an ex-architect, I'm calling myself an ex-architect nowadays, I immediately see ornament here, so we will have to discuss that. But what's important now is sort of what is actually the status of this relationality. Is it fully? If it is relational, then it's actually not so interesting, because then we got a clear separation between, let's say, a contracted state of a thing, which is contracted in itself, purely like Kant's noumenon, and then there's a state of the thing that exists in light, and that's the phenomenal state, and which appears in our minds, and in the mind of the ant that was walking on my table, or the beaver that was nibbling at the leg, though he didn't know it was a leg. So if it's relational, it wouldn't be so interesting. But I just want to suppose that this object, this Dijk's head, this fringed thingy, actually exists in a double state. So it doesn't exist by itself and then shows itself for us and ants and beavers and whatever, but it actually tries to bridge this chasm between reality and appearance. And of course that will be our main discussion, because that's why I brought up the notion of the figure as something that is actually capable of relating reality and appearance. And I deeply feel that any philosophy of the real must include appearances. It simply must, because if we do not, we cannot explain what happens in our minds and in our bodies, nor in the bodies of ants or beavers or whatever. because we feel, we have experiences, and we see them, we smell and whatever, and all those images, which are not appearances yet, right? Let's try to distinguish between those. But those flat things in our minds that are made of light might be coming from another state of light that is actually owned or actually part of the thing. So this is quite a radical idea. I'm not ascribing this radicalism to William James's radical empiricism. I just want to sort of use, maybe abuse or misuse this beautiful idea of the Dijk's head, and I want to place it in the context of the gift. So when things stretch out, already containing light, right? Not just being dark and contracted, but actually having some of that, and maybe not all of it, or more, maybe more of it. That when we see them, we just see like the smallest portion, the smallest possible portion of them, but they do radiate something. Now that I want to understand in the context of gift exchange, of gift cycles, and the gift as a very, very, very archaic notion. And this is not so strange, because the gift is a circulation of generosity, and it simply means that things are generous. So that notion of throwing, or that notion of reaching out or extending, but not being relational yet. I think that's what's so interesting about what the gift can bring for us, and also why it's misunderstood in phenomenology as givenness. Because here there's a notion of giving that is not received yet, right? So why do we have three figures in the grace, in the three graces, or in the gift cycle? We have giving, we have receiving, and we have thanking or returning, right? So we have these three states. That means that the gift is not given yet, or it's not received yet, right? So given in the proper sense of a reaching out actually means the thing is still an entity, and it's not in a relational state. It can have relations, but it doesn't change anything of its ontological state. And ontological state means that contraction and that expansion, which are Goethean terms, by the way, or Schelling's terms, actually coexist, and maybe there's not such a red line between them. Now, I mentioned givenness, which is Husserl's term, Gegebenheit. Husserl's term actually means, and it's a very idealist notion, it means we perceive, and perception and perceiving means, and it's very different from receiving, that it's taken, right? The word perception comes from capere, comes from taking. So perceiving is, it's not given, it's taken, right? So we're already in the second position of the gift cycle. It's not a gift, it's already received, right? It's already received. That's why obviously experience, subjectivity, the body, all those locuses of consciousness play such a hugely important role in phenomenology. Heidegger would say things are for themselves, but they show themselves for us, right? So that's that would be the formula of phenomenology, because it separates itself from ontology, from being. And I think that we have to be very clear there. If we want to bring some of that notion of what we are seeing and experiencing over to things, right, and by simply not accepting, there's this fundamental distinction between reality and appearance, then there must be some form of appearing that differs from, let's say, images or bundlings of images, or that things are just like a group of images. They must be, before they appear for us, they must appear for themselves, right? So there's not the contraction of being and then showing over there. There's actually a showing already on the level of things themselves, but it's an appearance as such, or an appearance by and of itself, right? So what I would call the figure then is not so much a thing, but it's a thing appearance, a thing dash appearance, which is a really ugly technical term, or an onto appearance. But somehow there's a state of light or a state of consciousness that's inherent to things, that's implied in things, that is much larger than what we can see, or what ants or beavers or whoever can see. But it is a state of shining. So the light is already there. And it's very blurred. It's very vague. That's why I compared it to the Italian term vaghezza. This beautiful word in from Firenzuola, which we discussed in the introduction, which means vagueness, but it also means charm, and it also means movement. Of course, we know that from the vaghezza, that relates to the vagabond, for instance, or the vague, the wave in French, right? So there is a vagueness. There's no, but there's also light. So what do we have here is that we get a state that is both opaque, like the skull of the Dijk's head model, and there's light, so that we don't get the separation between the two. We get a sort of a form of light, a form of shining that is in such a state of abundance and surplus that there must be opacity as well. Now, this opacity does not radically or theoretically differ from that state of light. It's basically just there's too much to see. But it does mean that things appear for themselves before they appear for us, right? So, and what we see, right, is just the tiniest fragment, and we call those fragments experiences or images. Now, what's also interesting is that in grace theory, it's not just a shining or radiance. I mean, the ancient Greek texts are full of these terms, right? Gleaming, glittering, shining. There's a sense of radiance, but there's also this power of limbs. There's this notion of well, I can almost see the connection between the feathers and the limbs of the bodies. I think you can even see it better here. Is that almost as if the parts are not internal to things anymore, but they're external to them. So that what they shine out. And of course we know that from experiences of beauty, when we get this cascading of effects coming out of things, is actually coming toward us. There's a towardness which runs parallel to their limbs, to their having of limbs. So this it's not just like a model of a core with things sticking out that we see on the left and that we also see on the right. It's a deeper connection between what movement is according to the world of limbs, what appearance is according to the world of light and consciousness. And now I know this is all pretty hardcore. Let me just go back to the gift, because I do want to sort of emphasize how important the cyclical is. It's very difficult to understand what a gift. There's hundreds and hundreds of books, of course, since Marcel Mauss's book from the 1920s, The Gift. But it is important to understand that it is not a two-stage exchange like between object and subject. There's something else going on. There's there's the giving, there's the receiving. Yes, but then it's not just like a returning of the same thing. There's actually transformation that allows it to return it. But there's also something else, a deeper ambiguity in what is actually owned here. Is this a world of economy? Is there a thing giving away according to a price? No, because it is given, but it's also kept, and often, and Marcel Mauss already saw that there's no free gift. Of course, in the post Second World War period, there was a lot of speculation on the free gift, and the surplus was pure sublime, and it was just like an ejection of parts, and it was called abundance was understood as a free gift. But I remember from Mary Douglas, the introduction to the gift, that she's very adamant about that there's no such thing as a free gift, and so what must be returned is already part of what was given. So there's an ambiguity of keeping and giving. It's almost like it's an elastic process. Things are given, but they're returned to it. But while they're being returned, they're being changed. So the giver becomes a receiver. It's a very intelligent and very interesting, especially, of course, I mean, the gift exchange is often understood as a sociological or an economical or whatever, an anthropological domain, but it is aesthetic because it's ruled. It occurs under the auspices of the three graces, so that makes it absolutely a part of this notion of the gift cycle. Now let's look at this. So we have a parallel or an analog between limbs, shining, and this idea of projection. I think what is important then to understand the parts as exterior to the thing is that we cannot just call them parts anymore. We should call them members. So if we just make that a theoretical statement, parts are at the interior of a whole, and members are at the exterior of a whole, right? And that membership is a going along with each other. So the notion of a member is much more active than the notion of a part, because parts are always contained as if they're in a bag, right? Any diagram of the whole and the part shows a big circle with small circles in it. Well, this model is very, very, very different. So, and it also means that, you know, when you have that circle with smaller circles in it, that's ownership. So the whole owns the parts. Now that's not the case with members. Members go along, but they're not being owned. Obviously, it's not a question of ownership because it's part of the gift cycle. So it's given as well as owned, or it's kept as well as given. Now, if we just look a bit more carefully at the Dijkstra model on the left, we just see, okay, it's clearly not standing; it's hanging, and the orangutan on the right is showing that, and I think this is very important. And here we're coming to the heart of what the notion of the figure is, because the figure is never one thing. The figure is always two things, and it's a turn. It's a turn between two things, and that's what the figure is, a tropos. A tropos means turn. So you cannot just understand standing as a form of pure stance. There must be this effect of hanging becoming part of that realm of standing, or that figure of standing. And of course, that for our argument. Can we invent, or can we find a form of standing that relates directly to hanging, right? Would it be possible to have standing exist as a forming, and if yes, how? Now let's just, because this sounds so weird, and I'm almost embarrassed. I hope I'm not shocking you too much. So let's just put these together. stance. Now, I just want to say that animals often personify figures very, very well because of their bodies, because of how they live, how they behave. I think that must be the reason why they were mythological figures a long, long time ago. But anyway, here we have the horse, and there we have the orangutan, the ape. That's already very interesting. The painting of George Stubbs shows the horse. You can see the torso, how large it is, and then how the legs come out, and how abstract, how incredibly abstract these legs are. They become completely smooth, and that's what in the book I wrote and I published a while ago, the Grace and Gravity book, is exactly how that animal touches foot space. Foot space is that horizontal plane, and how it is touching that foot space with the smallest possible members, the nails. And then there's hardly any grabbing. There's hardly any direct relationship to what I call hand space, a world of, or a polar realm of foot space. And on the other side of it, and of course we have that vertical axis of emergence linking them. And that's a world of grabbing and grasping. And you can see the brachiating ape is not 4 legs, but it's 4 arms. That's not an official biological statement, obviously, but you look at the feet, you see how they've been developed, evolved into hands. So we get like one animal living in hand space and one animal living in foot space. Now, obviously, let's just discuss this notion of stance first, and then how it relates to hanging. I already mentioned that the word exist or existence or to exist relates directly to stance. The Latin existere means to stand or to make stand or to stop. And ek means forth. That's coming from Greek. Of course, both have a Proto-Indo-European root. But it's clear that the word exist relates directly to stance. Now, that's not the only English word, obviously, that relates to sistere. We have insist, we have resist, we have assist. There's a whole insist, obviously. Range of persist of words that relate to stance, and strangely enough we get the same in German and in Dutch, by the way. So exist would be bestehen, stehen, of course, standing. Resist, widerstehen. Insist, aufstehen, ich stehe auf, right? Or assist, beistehen. So these are as clearly related to the notion of stance as in English. So they must have like the same root. Now, so for the figure of stance, this whole relationship to existence and reality is absolutely fundamental. Now, the big question is exactly what is the ape doing there? And I think we have to be a bit clear here about what realism and normally how realism is normally understood. Philosophical realism. This is wiki, so it should be simple. Philosophical realism means it's a philosophy of entities, and these entities are mind independent. They have a mind independent existence. This is essential. Now we should immediately ask ourselves, whose mind or what mind? So if it's our mind or that of the ant or the beaver or whatever, that's clear. But are they also independent of mind as such? That would be the main question. Now, the word independent or dependent means to hang from. So mind independence means not hanging from the mind, not hanging from. So independence, standfastness, right? To stand alone, to stand by itself means not to hang from, right? But we actually made it our mission, you know, to actually see if we can put these together. Now, let's just go back to the notion of standing, because it is quite an issue if this is actually independent, you know, because the ground is obviously structured. It is a form of standing on, and philosophically, you're in huge trouble, you know, when a thing can only exist because there's another thing. Because that you end up with the infinite number of turtles that are carrying the earth, or infinite regress. So, and of course, the word ground has so many meanings, right? It's not just like a physical structure. It is also reason. It is also things standing on firm ground. There's as like in the German Grund. It really means cause or reason. So a thing behind another thing, right? So stance is in that sense not so independent at all. So we have to find a form of stance that actually liberates itself from the ground, right? So this already sounds like Baron von Münchhausen, you know, the guy who lifted himself up by his own hair from a swamp. But a groundless form of standing would be the answer. So somehow we have to find a way to merge that world of strength, of structure and support, of standing, as well as that world of dependence or weakness. Almost like the opposition between work and play. You know, you get that the world of ergon, you know, of support and structure, and that world of leisure. I'm again thinking of structure and ornament, but we'll get to that. But it is an opposition of strength and weakness that becomes unopposed and starts to merge, right? So there's two types. And I think we have to be very clear here. If we go back to this stance and the ape, we have to understand that these are two forms of realism. And since the last 20-30 years, we've just been discussing all those ideas of things, but we didn't see a lot of realism in art. We saw a lot of realism in sociology, archaeology, anthropology, all that. But not in art. Why? Because in art, the word realism has such a different meaning. Because that's mimetic. And of course apes and the quality of apery directly relates to that. So we have now two types of realism. We have the realism of mind-independent stance realism. It's a world for itself, by itself. And this mimetic, this mimesis realism is a very important. So this is almost unbearable, you know. This is I just want to sort of make this very clear. Is when things stand by themselves and we see them, or we see their color, the orange. Maybe we smell them, we feel them. How can these experiences, which is the world of the phenomenal, which we then express with art by being mimetic, how can that not be part of the thing, right? So our mission in that sense is to actually try to say, okay, stance realism and mimetic realism, these need to be as far overlapped as possible. which obviously brings you into huge trouble when you're in philosophy. But I'm not sure if I'm in philosophy. But this is the reason why I brought up the figure of the contrapposto, because the contrapposto figure. I have to explain more clearly here. The figure that you see on the left is the doryphoros. The doryphoros means the spear bearer. And you cannot see how he bears the spear because the arm is broken off. But this is a Roman copy, 1st century BC, of a 5th century BC, very, very, very famous sculpture by Polykleitos. Polykleitos was the first to actually invent this form of contrapposto. I'm just using the Italian term for now, because we actually need another term, but contrapposto says a lot already, because posto is poise, and poise is weight, and weight relates to gravity, obviously. So contrapposto means countering gravity, there we enter the world of grace, obviously, but these are now merged. So grace is not a separate thing from gravity in this notion of the contrapposto, but just by using the word, it means counterpoising or counterstance. Something we really have to understand how that works. So first it's a statue. So Polykleitos wrote a famous book, which has been lost, but it's been referred to, for instance, by Galen in the 2nd century book, as an invention of this structure. We know from Polykleitos he had very complex ideas, for instance, on symmetry, which we'll get to as well. This notion of symmetria. Symmetria in ancient Greece was something very, very different from what we call symmetry. What we call something symmetrical, we mean it has two halves that are the same according to a mirror axis. Symmetria actually means a harmony of parts, of members. So the members, and there's some discussion of what Polykleitos actually used. So he didn't use, let's say, the wooden mannequin that we still see in artists when they make a figure. He actually had a structure that included ropes, and the ropes had knots because of the proportions of the limbs, obviously. But this is not just a proportional system. This is a proportional system that relates to movement, and that interrelates these parts. So often the word symmetria is translated with the term proportion. That's not correct. Proportion would just be like any other dead body, just like with a number of parts that have certain proportional relations to each other mathematically. But in this case, they're being expressed by movement. So we get something very, very interesting here. Also, Polykleitos, the statue differs enormously from the statues before him. Let's say 8th or 10th century Greece would make very different sculptures of young males in this case. At first they would be standing almost like the Egyptian sculptures with their hands like straight next to their torso, and the legs straight next to each other. And then a bit later we got the Kouros, which is actually also quite a stiff young male, but there's actually one leg put forward as if it is in motion. That's not what the contrapposto figure, the doryphoros, is actually doing. It's not a representation of movement. We're not seeing a sculptor that is trying to mimic a figure of movement, which would be highly problematic because the word statue already means stance. No, so there's the movement of the members, but they actually create stance. Now this is something highly complex, and This is why we have to discuss Leonardo. You see a few terms here. Let me see if I can find them. De serpeggiare e bilico. That means undulating or snaking, serpeggiatura, or serpentine. Of course, serpent means snake. E bilico poise, right? So this is about an undulating movements and equipoise. And again, now I just have to remind you of Edmund Burke's formula of grace, which is very much related to this one. Is that there's a flux, a notion of rhythm, of meandering, and a notion of stance. So posture and motion, but it's a very precise notion of motion. It's not just like speed or anything. It's just a waving motion, and that's where we get to. Let's say somebody like Pierre Hadot, who wrote about the work of Félix Ravaisson. Félix Ravaisson, the French 19th century, early 19th century philosopher who had very interesting ideas on habit. I cannot quote the whole thing and discuss the work, but he was very much interested in contrapposto. He actually studied the Venus de Milo, which was discovered mid-19th century, and he tried to sort of invent what the arms were, how the arms were placed, and what that body, how the whole, if you would actually reconstruct it, how that whole body of the Venus de Milo would actually look. But he also wrote on habit, and he wrote on habit as a form of grace. And I think that's important in our case, a prevenient grace or enabling grace, which is a religious term. We'll get to that as well. But it is a form of rhythm, of a wave line. And that wave line clearly relates to the serpeggiare of Leonardo da Vinci. And Pierre Hadot is actually, when he reads Félix Ravaisson, he's actually a bit more radical. He actually says, okay, this is the line of flux. The contrapposto is the figure of flux, and I'm relating to this. I think it's important because these are not of minor importance. These figures, Pierre Hadot and Félix Ravaisson, and we should make very clear, how this idea of contrapposto actually differs from that line of grace or that line of movement. I'm using the word line of grace because that's what William Hogarth actually used as well in the mid 18th century. Now we know the serpeggiare from the figura serpentinata, from mannerism, and often mannerism as well as Hogarth serpentines as well as Pierre Hadot are all describing this as a representation of movement. Like rhythm is a representation of movement. To put it simple, I oppose that notion. Obviously there is movement, there's a whole coordination of movement, but they only have one result, and that is stance. So if you would draw like a diagram over the Doryphoros, you would see actually snaking figures. From one shoulder to the hip on the other side, back to the foot on the other side. So you can two braiding serpentines, and the arms could work with that. And we see that in mannerism much more elaborate. But you cannot deny that there is a sharp vertical running through this statue, which is a dashed line. It's a ghosted line, but it is vertical. And it is gravity. So whatever grace is doing, it's not opposing gravity. It's actually collaborating or managing gravity. I think that's an important conclusion of this Leonardo's very early idea of this grace in the limbs. So how to actually paint figures standing. So this is a remnant or an echo of Polykleitos, which is 2,000 years earlier, right? Now let's see what this actually means, right? So what do we have? We have a standing figure, but it's not standing strongly, it's standing weakly. It is actually hanging in itself, right? So what we see in the contrapposto is a merging of the standing and the hanging position, right? And I think that's exactly what makes it a figure. A figure is not just like a sculpture of anything. A figure is actually a turn, right? In this case, one of movements towards stance, right? So we got moving of members that actually create the stance of the whole. But what happens then to the whole is that the whole shines, right? Gracefully. So we have a double movement. We have one of the members towards the whole that stands, and the stance actually moving, well, sideways almost, because it's coming toward us. There's a towardness to the Doryphoros. It's not just standing by itself. It's actually a showing of itself. It's actually having parts that move sideways. You see the knee, the arms, the head, they're all like moving sideways while others standing vertically, like that standing leg. So we have a double movement. I'd say my first argument, the one from movement to stance, still fits with the idea of new materialism. There's agency of parts, in this case members. There's agency and they create a whole. And that whole exists, that means it stands by itself. Right? So that fits with new materialism. But that other argument that figure now starts to radiate, right, and is actually beautiful or graceful, that's something else. So what we get is almost like you get a figure of turning which points downward and then makes a curve, comes up, makes a curve and moves sideways as an appearance, and then comes toward us. Right, so there's this construct. I'm not claiming that this is the truth. I'm just saying this is a theoretical construct because we have to be uncertain. The moment we put reality and appearance, or we try to put reality and appearance on top of each other, we're basically deeply into the speculative, right? I hope that's clear. And so we have to construct it precisely, but we cannot claim truth here. We have to be tentative and we have to be hesitant and try very, very different things, right? So there's the notion of stance, and I think that notion of stance does relate to the skull, or to this notion of opacity, that we cannot fully reach and we cannot fully access things, but they do come toward us. They have this twist in them that makes them shine and spill out in that sense. It's a spilling over. Spilling relates to spiel, to play. So we see the opposition of work and play also, well, I wouldn't say resolved, but merged in that sense. Now let's look at another model of existence. These are very, very weird, because we have existence as an idea of standing. We do not see pure stance on the left, and we certainly don't see stance on the right, which is the torso. In Rilke's words, the archaische torso Apollos, the archaic torso of Apollo. And of course, Rilke being the poet of things, of Dinggedichte, we have to look at this model. These are very classical, they're very canonical models, but obviously I'm not using them in a canonical manner. So we get stance and hanging on the left side, and we got legless torso on the right side as a model of existence, because it does shine. It's the poem of Rilke is very clear. It speaks of glühen. The torso glüht. there's a glowing of this thing, and it's looking at you. The poem actually describes that thing looking at you. So that's a way of like how I describe this, the Dayak's head, or the frayed thing, or the thing appearance. So there is a shining, but it is different, and it is different because it's not a limb model. On the left we see a limb model, which relates to grace, obviously, but also to Ravaisson's law of the limbs, right? So he describes grace as following the law of the limbs, and and of course that links to the posture and motion as well of Edmund Burke. While on the right we don't see a head, we don't see arms, and we just see a bit of legs. It's a disabled body, and it's the most beautiful torso. So I'm thinking there's almost like a contrast between two realisms, a limb philosophy on the left and a torso philosophy on the right. And we know this torso philosophy because Peter Sloterdijk famously used Rilke's title "Du musst dein Leben ändern," which is the very last sentence of the poem on the Archaische torso, Apollos. "Du musst dein Leben ändern," you must change your life, right? So that thing is an imperative. It's looking at you and it's challenging you to actually change your life, which is a fabulously beautiful idea. Sloterdijk, we must discuss him. Because he relates to this notion of the torso as a sphere, a thing in itself. So we're almost going back to the skull here, which he borrows from Bachelard, we have to say. Bachelard, well known for architects because of his Poetics of Space. Actually, Poetics of Space, very clear about repose. Bachelard's an anti-Bergsonian philosopher and a phenomenologist, but a very psychological one. And his psychology is always about reverie, about daydreaming. And this daydreaming is really a quality of repose. He wrote very often about repose, and the house in the Poetics of Space plays a very important role. And his idea of being, he says it very clearly: being is round, Dasein is rund. Not sure if being and Dasein are the same, but that's not the point at the moment. But it's a round concept. So there's the skull, and there's the chest, and there's the house, and there's the universe, and these are all like spheres and spheres and spheres and spheres. And the chest, now we go from the torso to the chest, right? It's really the locus of this repose. And this rhythm of breathing is then centered, but centered by contraction onto itself, right? It is really a very powerful model, very similar to the limb model in the sense of radiance and rhythm. But while one is sort of saying, well, you know, this is the movement before actual movement, right? There's no way we can be in repose and being separated from movement. It would be impossible to get out of a chair. You know, it would be impossible for a bird to jump from its nest. You know, even there would be some form of movement present in the body when it's in repose, right? So this idea of movement and object, they need to be merged. While actually, in the case of the torso philosophy, they actually it's actually repose that becomes the most important. Now we know from the sphere trilogy how important spheres are, or how important the torso is, and breathing is to Sloterdijk. Breathing, of course, with this notion of atmospheres. We saw it in the book of Latour at the beginning as well. But there's also this other book, Zorn und Zeit, Rage and Time, which brings this idea of the chest all to another level. And this idea of the chest is really about, dare I say it, manliness or standfastness. I remember a chapter by C.S. Lewis, "Men without chests right? So he's complaining that in liberal democracy there's no men with chests anymore. And of course, with In Zorn und Zeit, in Rage and Time, this book by Sloterdijk, he refers to Fukuyama. Fukuyama writes exactly about this, as the chest, as this thing in the middle, right? So we have the head on the top, and we have the chest, and then the genitals, and that means logos, themos, or thymos, thumos, and eros, right? So this is from Plato's Republic. And of course, Fukuyama argues quite similarly to C.S. Lewis that liberal democracy is obsessed with reason, with logos, and with desire, eros, but completely forgot themos. Themos means spiritedness, but it can also mean rage or anger. And it's quite clear that for Socrates, because Plato's quoting Socrates, that themos is actually something that cannot be reduced to logos or eros, though it sometimes is similar, but it's actually a quality of contour. So Dasein ist rund, the skull of William James, and the torso and the spheres of Sloterdijk. You should put all those on together, and it's not unimportant. It's extremely important, but it does fit in the classic opposition of grace and gravity, because grace and gratia et gravitas, the Latin, is actually a translation of the Greek charis and semnos. Semnos meant seriousness, or august, and serious. Actually, the word serious refers to the German schwer, so it's a heaviness. It's about dignity, self-esteem. So themos actually takes care of self-esteem, and Sloterdijk, and not insensitive to gift structures, actually tries to understand what this realm of themos is. And I'm just wondering, of course, we know the notion of dignity from Schiller as well, Anmut und Würde, which translates in English as grace and dignity. Grace and dignity were also the title of a chapter in a book by Henry Home in the 1700s. So that's a classic opposition. That's the classic opposition that fits completely in the grace and gravity opposition, which I try to deny, or try to find a rebuttal. And I'm trying to say, well, that figure on the left actually engages gravity and deals with it. It's not levitating, it's not flying away, it's not pure lightness. It's a standing lightly. Right, so, and that other model is trying to, that model, the torso model, is actually trying to contract on itself, limbless, right, trying to find its own substance and its own essence as that skull, right, and the more it loses its limbs, the more it actually shines and shines out, and I just want to talk a bit about this notion of self-esteem. Fukuyama uses the term megalothymia, which means a sense of superiority, or a drive towards it. And I want to compare that to Aristotle's megaloprepeia, which actually means liberality. Now, I'm not opposing conservative and liberal here, but there is this notion of liberality, and that actually means that yes, there is self-esteem, but it doesn't just like radiate out of that torso. It actually comes from exchanging gifts. So Aristotle is very clear in the Nicomachean Ethics that the more there's wealth accumulated, of course this is a model it's about borders, it's about accumulation, it's about finding a contour. It's this first contour of the skull, It might relate to death. That has to be responded by largesse, by generosity. So there's no way you can have pure self-esteem, right, without that self-esteem being responded to in a political model that gives you esteem and you give it away, right? So there's this notion of dignity that has to be found, right? There's not just like dignity in a way that you can pump up into self-esteem. You can pump your chest, of course, like gorillas do, but there must be some form of exchange. So in that sense, the grace or charis model is quite an alternative to the themos model. It doesn't deny themos, but it tries to relate them to logos and eros in another system of exchange. Now, let me just try to round this up, because the word that is used by Polykleitos, it seems, because we don't know exactly, is chiasmos, and this is the letter chi. Of course, in English you would say chi, but what is truly interesting is that the chi figure is not an X figure. So, and now we have to discuss what this notion of chi or the chiastic or chiasmos or chiasmus. I think in rhetoric it would be chiasmos. How that relates symmetry to asymmetry, because generally in figures of speech, in rhetoric, and I think this is why it's important, because it seems that through Polykleitos the notion of chiastic is actually a sculptural invention and not a rhetorical one. So the figure of speech that we know as chiasmus, like in Macbeth, foul is fair and fair is foul, whereas the reverse, is a purely symmetrical one. Purely symmetrical one. Well, often you also find chiastic structures in rhetoric, in figures of speech, that are not so symmetrical. I found a Walt Whitman. I may be as bad as the worst, but I'm as good as the best. So as bad as the worst and as good as the best. So there's many other examples in rhetoric. Now what's interesting here is that symmetry and asymmetry coexist. Now this will be very difficult for architects to understand, because for architects, and we'll discuss this in the second part of the lecture, for architects symmetry means symmetry of form. So, and of course all things exist in two states, as an organization and as a form. So for them, a symmetrical organization means a symmetrical form. Ergo, Greek temples, or Baroque palaces, or whatever symmetrical buildings, they have a symmetrical form. Now what do we see on the left in the contrapposto is something very different and far more intelligent. Because what do we see? That body is symmetrical. Well, when it would have its legs and all its fingers, it would be a symmetrical body. As an organization, the left elbow, left hand, right shoulder, left eye, right eye. So we get this symmetry of an organization, but we get the asymmetry of a form, because the left shoulder is moving up, then the left hip is moving up, and then the right foot is moving up. You can see how the heel actually leaves the ground, and it's the reverse on the other side, right? So the right shoulder for the figure, the right, not for us, the right shoulder is going down, then the hip on the other side, and the left hip is going down, and then that right foot actually stands right? So we get these two S's that are intersecting. So that makes it asymmetry and symmetry at the same time. Now, this is super complicated, and obviously in architecture there are not a lot of examples. But what's important for us is that there's a doubling. I think that's why the chiastic figure is really the primary figure of speech, more even than metaphor or metonymia or synecdoche or all these sort of figures, you know, irony. They're all like mirroring, they're all like doubling figures, but they're never like contract the doubling in itself. They always sort of refer outward. Well, this one finds the outward in itself. It's not like it's self-mirroring or it's hanging in itself, right? So the mimetic, you know, is now part of the stance, right? That's the argument. So in that sense, it is as if that, excuse me, that sort of asymmetry becomes a new figure, a loop, right? It's not just an X or a distorted X or an asymmetrical X, but it actually sort of its contour itself is like twisted, right? So it's where torso and limbs now become interconnected. And I think that's so interesting about the contrapposto. It's both torso as well as limbs. It's not a pure limb figure. It's not a pure torso figure as what we saw in the torso of Apollo. But there's a relationship as a form, not just as a rhythm, but there's a relationship as a form between the proportions of the torso and the limbs. Obviously, you know, you look at a whale, you get very different relationships between the torso and the limbs. If you look at a spider, you get, again, very different relations. So you can index those relations, those ratios. So it's not just the proportions of things, but it's actually a seeing, okay, there's a torso element, a contractive element, and there's an outward element of limbs and movement. I'm almost at the end, I'm losing my voice, obviously. I just want to sort of connect that idea, because here the figure 8 is an O figure, but then twisted, right? So you're using the twisting of the chi figure and the contour. So you're trying to merge like two models. Now those two models we know, I don't want to go too long into this, but because we will be discussing the figure very often. But on the left we have a text of a page of Erich Auerbach from a famous mimesis book from 1946. And on the right we have Gilles Deleuze's idea of the figural, which he put forward in his book on Francis Bacon. Excuse me. Now, which one we'll discuss first? The figura, you see that word at the top on the left, is an article by Erich Auerbach from 1938, where he's very clear about how the figure relates to plastic form and to sculpture and statues. So it's not just a rhetorical element, but it's actually an element that we know from sculpture. I think that's the first thing that's important. Then he relates the whole idea of metaphor, and let's not forget that the word metaphor means to carry over. So there's a notion of an arc in the idea of it. You bring one thing to another, and that idea of an arc becomes almost like a messianic arc in Auerbach, because he refers a lot to medieval Christian writings, where figures are prefigured. So there's a real historical figure at one moment in time, and then there's the second figure. Oh, that sounds like Christ, right? So the second coming, right? So there's these loops over history, and these loops relate directly to the way we write history, to historiography. So the use of metaphor that he's studying in the Mimesis book, and that's by all different writers, from early Greek and Christian all the way to Virginia Woolf and Marcel Proust. It's all about at what point is it realistic? At what point is it real? And for him, that is this bringing together of these two figures that are separated. So there's what he calls a seriousness to realism. It's really an advocating of serious realism, and I think that's important because seriousness relates to the German Schwer, as I said, to heaviness and gravity. So it's about how things come down and how they happen. And that relates to Greek tragedy. So there's a whole loop which is far more complex than a simple notion of the figurative as an idea of mimesis. Now on the other side we have Deleuze's text, which we must compare to other French notions or usages of the word figure. We find it in Roland Barthes, we find it in Michel Serres, we find it in Jean-François Lyotard, and we find it in Gilles Deleuze. So they all use this word figure as a way of being between the abstract and the figurative. So there's still figure, but it doesn't represent, right? So it stays away from the image, and the way he uses that is in the analysis of the paintings of Francis Bacon. Now I just want to say that Roland Barthes and his use of the figure is much closer to Auerbach in that sense. He uses this as a statue. He talks about, in the Lover's Discourse, he talks about I used a quote in the brief of the seminar as a statue and not as a rhetorical figure. Also in How to Live Together, you see a lot of the usage of the notion of a figure. Also in Michel Serres, I remember an interview between Michel Serres and Bruno Latour. And Bruno Latour says, how is it possible that you write about the space shuttle disaster in 1986 with the Challenger? It was called the Challenger. That explosion on just after like 10 seconds after it was launched, it exploded in the sky, killing like 7 astronauts, among which one civilian. How is it possible that you compare that to the Moloch, to this iron, I think it's iron statue in Baal? And of course Baal in the Bible is like the most evil empire, where every year 7 children were sacrificed by fire. How is it possible that you bring that sort of the Moloch and the Challenger together? And he says this is a figural notion. This is the figure, exactly. A figure jumps through time and it changes, and so that's why a figure is not a concept or an idea or a symbol. It's not a symbol and it's not an image. A figure is actually an acting entity, almost like a Greek god who changes and metamorphosizes, but stays that figure. And in this case, this the figure of sacrifice, and obviously the sacrifice of 7 children relates to the labyrinth on Crete as well. So we got quite a philosophy of the figure before Deleuze uses that, and I think Deleuze is somewhere else. I think Deleuze is much closer to what we know as deconstruction. So we start like with a painting that is quasi-mimetic, so the figure stands or they have different postures. We know the paintings of Francis Bacon, beautiful. And then there's swiping and wipings and spasms. That's how he describes them. So it's the weakness comes afterwards. So you have structure first. and then you wipe and turn and twist and deform, and we know this in architecture. We got structure, we get normative structure first, and then we break and cut and tilt and bend and whatever. These are deconstructive movements, but they're all lies. You know, the weakness comes after the structure. It doesn't destroy the structure because the painting is still there. It just destroys the image, right? So it doesn't look like somebody. Well, it looks a bit like somebody. It actually looks a bit like somebody who's disabled. So in that sense, it's very close to the notion of the torso, or the torso of Apollo. So we got one model of mimesis and the other is physis, right? So I think in that sense, Deleuze's model is what we call a morphogenetic model. It's a model that rises up from matter, pure paint in this case, and tries to become an image, but stops just before it is an image. But of course it's painted the other way around. There's structure first and then the wipings. So it's very, very double. Now let me just end with this image, because talking about mimesis in another way in the context of a gift structure means something else than representational mimesis or imitation. And that's why I'm referring to Narcissus, this is the painting by Caravaggio. The idea of representation is actually what I would call a reflective mimesis. It's a flat surface. It's a flat surface. So you're seeing yourself reversed in the mirror. There's a flat mirror. What Narcissus sees, Narcissus is not crazy. He's not in love with himself. He's actually in love with somebody else. And that somebody else is deep at the bottom of the pond. So it's another type of mirror. It's a deep mirror. It's a mirror hidden in structure, and that's what I would call an absorptive mimesis, right? So we got two types of mimesis, and they're not represented here because they're both sort of an idea of absorptive mimesis, because obviously, when the Doryphoros is mirroring himself, and Narcissus is falling in love with the other, that's becomes the same structure of absorptive mimesis. So in the gift cycle, you have to understand it like this: there's the shining of the thing appearance of Aglaia. Right, she's the central figure. She's the most important figure of the three graces. And then it's received, and this reception is really an act of absorptive mimesis. So that I think would conclude in the sense that now we have a model of groundless standing, right? So we set ourselves the task to say, okay, we do accept standing, but we do want to not stand it on the ground, but hang it in itself. And I want to sort of end with this sort of fictional model of Baron von Münchhausen, who does hang by himself. He accidentally runs his horse into the mire, right, a swamp, and he gets out by lifting himself, what you in English would call bootstrapping, right? This is this fantastic idea of, it's not the way to illustrate serious realism, it's more a way to illustrate magical realism, and maybe we are far closer to this idea of magical realism. What is interesting is that now he is floating on the left like the octopus. He is pondering the one on the right, there's one standing. There's, we've seen hanging, so we see a merging of many, many figures. For the next talk, we are going to look at architecture and the notion of weight much more clearly, especially architecture and its combination of symmetry and asymmetry, and how the mineral and the vegetal play a role in that. We're also going to look at the notion of carrying and bearing. So there's how does that relate to behavior, and how does that relate to again to stance, right? And dealing with gravity. So thank you for your attention.